Johnny Carson, the king of late night. For 30 years, he ruled American television, charming millions with a smile, a joke, and that effortless wit. Every night, Hollywood's biggest stars sat on his couch. Actors, musicians, comedians, all hoping for that moment of magic, that nod of approval from Johnny himself. Because in those days, if Johnny liked you, America liked you. But if he didn't, your career could vanish overnight. What no one knew was that behind that warm smile, Johnny was keeping score. He had a secret list, a private blacklist of stars he refused to respect. Celebrities the world worshipped, but whom Johnny considered cruel, manipulative, or fake. To the audience, they were icons. To Carson, they were monsters in tuxedos. He had one simple rule: how you treated the people who couldn't help you. If you were kind to the crew, the assistants, the camera operators, Johnny respected you forever. But if you were cruel to them, he never forgot. Over the years, he quietly shared stories, shocking stories of stars who shattered their image when the cameras stopped rolling. And tonight, we reveal those names. These are the 5 stars Johnny Carson despised the most, the guests who turned his smile into a mask and exposed the dark side of Hollywood's golden age. Let's dive in. Number 1. Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis. To most of America, he was a comedy legend, a national treasure. The manic energy, the slapstick humor, the silly voices and physical comedy that made millions of people laugh for decades. He starred in dozens of movies, directed films, even invented the video playback system that's still used in filmmaking today. But what really made people love Jerry Lewis was his charity work. Every single year, he hosted a massive telethon to raise money for children's health causes. The Jerry Lewis MDA telethon became an American tradition. People would watch Jerry cry on national television, begging viewers to donate for sick children. He presented himself as a saint, a man who cared so deeply about helping kids that he dedicated his life to it. America ate it up. He was a hero. But Johnny Carson saw something very different. When Jerry Lewis came on to The Tonight Show, the crew dreaded it. Absolutely dreaded it. Because behind the scenes, the man who claimed to care so deeply about children and charity could be shockingly cruel to the very people who worked to make him look good. According to multiple staff accounts, Lewis treated production crews with open contempt. He barked orders at people, refused to learn anyone's name. Just called them, "Hey you," or "camera guy." He acted like the crew were beneath him, like they were servants instead of professionals doing their jobs. One lighting technician said, "He treated us like we were dirt on his shoe." But Lewis didn't just save his cruelty for underlings. He went after Johnny Carson himself. In one infamous appearance, Jerry repeatedly interrupted Johnny during the interview. He hijacked questions that were meant for other guests. At one point, he even reached over and adjusted Carson's tie without asking permission. Now, that might not sound like a big deal, but everyone on staff knew one ironclad rule. You did not touch Johnny Carson unless he initiated it. Lewis knew that rule too. And some insiders believed he broke it deliberately, just to establish dominance, to show that he didn't have to follow the same rules as everyone else. You could see the irritation flash across Johnny's face, but being the professional he was, he kept smiling and moved on. But what really disgusted Carson was the hypocrisy. He would watch Jerry cry during those telethons, presenting himself as this selfless humanitarian who loved children. And then he'd see the exact same man treat staff members like trash the moment the cameras turned off. The contrast was sickening to Johnny. One staffer described Lewis as demeaning, dismissive, and downright hostile to anyone who couldn't advance his career. After one particularly tense encounter in the early 1980s, Carson made a rare decision. He blacklisted Jerry Lewis from The Tonight Show entirely. Think about that. Carson tolerated a lot of difficult guests for the sake of ratings. The show was a business, after all. But Lewis crossed a line that Johnny wouldn't forgive. Years later, in private conversations, Carson didn't hold back about his feelings. He reportedly said, "In a town filled with egos and phonies, Jerry Lewis stood out as truly hateful. That's brutal." But coming from someone as professional and diplomatic as Johnny Carson, it means something. Jerry Lewis represented everything Johnny despised about Hollywood: the fakeness, the cruelty disguised as charity. The idea that fame gave you permission to treat people badly, and for Johnny that was unforgivable. Number 2, Mickey Rooney. If Jerry Lewis was a hypocrite, Mickey Rooney was just a mess. Mickey Rooney was once Hollywood's golden boy. In the late 1930 seconds and early 1940 seconds, he was the #1 box office draw in America. Think about that. Not just popular. The biggest star in the entire country. He was the cheerful, energetic kid audiences fell in love with in the Andy Hardy films. America's favorite teenager. He was a living link to Hollywood's golden age, a piece of history. So when he came on The Tonight Show in the 1970 seconds, his name still carried that glow of nostalgia and royalty. But behind the legend, Rooney had developed a reputation that made producers and staff nervous the moment they saw his name on the schedule. To put it bluntly, Carson thought Rooney had never grown up. He might have been in his 50 seconds and 60 seconds during his Tonight Show appearances, but his behavior was more like a reckless teenager. For one thing, Rooney had serious problems with alcohol. Multiple staff members claimed he showed up intoxicated more than once, slurring his words, stumbling through stories, losing his train of thought mid-sentence on live television. In one infamous appearance, he launched into a story about Judy Garland that veered into territory so inappropriate that Carson had to abruptly cut him off and change the subject right there on live TV. Imagine how bad it had to be for Johnny Carson, who was pretty unshakable, to actually interrupt a guest and shut down a story. After that taping, Carson was overheard asking his producer, "Is he drunk, or is this just who he is now?" But the alcohol wasn't even the worst part. What really troubled people was Rooney's behavior toward women on set. Several production assistants dreaded being assigned to work with him because he had developed a reputation for crossing boundaries. Former staffers recalled how he would grab a woman's hand a little too long when she brought him water, pull her closer under the guise of having a conversation, make comments that left them visibly uncomfortable. By the 1970 seconds, that kind of behavior was already unacceptable, and Carson, who wasn't exactly known as a moral crusader, was still embarrassed enough to personally apologize to women who had to deal with it. One director later said, "I've never seen Johnny so personally embarrassed by a guest's behavior." Think about that. Johnny Carson had interviewed thousands of people. He'd seen it all. And Mickey Rooney was the one who left him personally embarrassed. Eventually, Carson made adjustments to limit the damage. Rooney's appearances became less frequent. And when he was booked, tapings were sometimes shifted to earlier in the day to reduce the risk of him showing up drunk. It was Johnny's way of minimizing the chaos while still respecting Rooney's legendary status. But even with those precautions, Rooney remained a liability. Someone you had to manage and control just to get through a taping without incident. He represented something Carson despised, a star who thought his fame excused behavior that would never be tolerated anywhere else. If Rooney left Carson embarrassed, the next guest left him absolutely infuriated, because when it came to Bette Davis, her tongue was sharper than any knife. Number 3, Bette Davis. Bette Davis was Hollywood royalty. That unmistakable voice, that razor-sharp wit, 2 Academy Awards, decades of iconic performances. She was one of the greatest actresses of her generation, a true legend. By the time she appeared on The Tonight Show, Davis was already a living piece of film history. And audiences tuned in to hear her tell old Hollywood stories in that fiery, unforgettable style. On camera, she could be funny, charming, and absolutely captivating. But off camera, Carson found her exhausting. Crew members described her as confrontational, sharp-tongued, and impossible to please. She didn't just trade witty insults for laughs. She genuinely cut people down, made them feel small. When she was booked alongside other guests, especially younger performers or other women, Davis would interrupt constantly, dominate the entire conversation, and even physically turn her back on them as if they didn't exist. One talent coordinator remembered, "If someone else was getting laughs, You could see her seething. She was already plotting how to take the spotlight back. It was all about her, always. But worse than her ego was how she treated the staff. Davis reportedly demanded whiskey in her dressing room before tapings, and when she'd been drinking, her remarks became even more brutal. Makeup artists and cue card holders remembered her using sexist and racist insults without any hesitation. One makeup artist recalled Davis refusing to let her do her job, sneering, "Find me someone whose hands don't shake like a drunk." The woman wasn't shaking because she was nervous or incompetent. She was shaking because Bette Davis was verbally abusing her. For Johnny Carson, who usually avoided confrontation at all costs, Bette Davis pushed him past his limit. During one rehearsal, she started berating a cue card holder for being too slow. Carson stepped in. Quietly but firmly, he told her, "Miss Davis, on this show we speak to everyone with respect, or we don't speak at all." According to people who were there, Davis was stunned. She wasn't used to being challenged. Most people were too intimidated by her legend to stand up to her, but she actually backed down in that moment. The damage was done, though. Carson had seen who she really was. After her final appearance in the early 1980 seconds, Carson told his producer, "That's the last time. Life's too short to be verbally abused by Bette Davis, no matter how many Oscars she has." Carson admired her immense talent. He respected her legacy as an actress. But he also believed that talent didn't give anyone the right to humiliate people who were just trying to do their jobs. And for Johnny, that was a line you didn't cross. If Bette Davis represented the razor-sharp cruelty of old Hollywood, the next name on Carson's blacklist represented something even darker: raw intimidation. Because when Frank Sinatra walked into a room, even Johnny Carson felt the tension. Number 4. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was one of the most powerful entertainers of the 20th century. To the public, he was Old Blue Eyes, the smooth crooner with the velvet voice, the ultimate symbol of class, charm, and cool. On The Tonight Show, he could crack jokes, tell stories, and leave the audience hanging on every single word. But Carson saw something far more menacing beneath all that charm. Behind the scenes, Sinatra brought an atmosphere of fear with him wherever he went. He rarely arrived alone. Instead, he'd roll into the NBC studios with an entourage of up to 8 men, not fellow entertainers or musicians, not managers or agents, but what staff quietly described as guys you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. They would spread throughout the building, watching the crew, lurking in hallways, creating this sense that the entire studio was under surveillance. One cameraman later said, "It felt like being on set with the mob. You felt like if you looked at him the wrong way, something might happen." That's not an exaggeration. That's a direct quote from someone who worked there. And then there were Sinatra's outbursts. During one taping in the early 1970 seconds, a floor manager gave Sinatra the standard 3 minutes cue before his segment. This was routine procedure. Every single guest got the same cue. It's just how live television works. Sinatra didn't take it well. According to multiple witnesses, he grabbed the man by his tie, pulled him close, and hissed, "Nobody tells me when I've got 3 minutes. I'll go on when I'm ready." The floor manager, a Korean War veteran who'd seen real combat, was left visibly shaken. Johnny Carson was watching from his office monitor. He nearly pulled the plug on the entire segment. The only reason he didn't was because his producer reminded him of the ratings Sinatra would bring in. But Carson never forgot that moment. He hated bullies, especially when they picked on people who couldn't fight back. His patience grew thinner when Sinatra began canceling appearances at the last minute. Sometimes, after already arriving at the building, he'd simply decide he wasn't in the mood and leave. The final straw came during a commercial break when Sinatra made a cruel comment about a female staff member's appearance loud enough for others to hear. For once, Carson broke his usual detached professionalism and snapped back, "We don't talk about my staff that way here." People who were there said the tension in the room was electric. You could have cut it with a knife. Sinatra wasn't used to being challenged, especially not on someone else's show. After that incident, Carson limited Sinatra's appearances to once a year at most. For a host who rarely interfered with bookings, That was a strong statement. Behind the smile, Johnny couldn't stand the way Sinatra used his power. Charm for the cameras, intimidation for everyone else. And yet, even Sinatra wasn't the one who disturbed Carson the most. That spot was reserved for a Hollywood legend whose icy charm melted the moment the cameras turned off. For Johnny Carson, Joan Crawford was the true queen of cruelty. Number 5. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford was the definition of old Hollywood glamour. Immaculate hair, flawless posture, that commanding presence that made you sit up straighter just watching her. When she sat on Johnny Carson's couch in 1970, audiences saw nothing but grace and elegance. She embodied everything people thought a movie star should be. But Carson quickly learned that beneath the polished exterior, Crawford was an absolute nightmare. Even before she arrived at the studio, her demands set the tone for disaster. She sent over a 4-page memo detailing everything from the exact angle of her chair to the studio temperature, which had to be exactly 67 degrees. Not 66, not 68, exactly 67. She even brought her own makeup team, dismissing the Tonight Show's award-winning artists as if they weren't good enough to touch her face. And once she was inside the building, the facade of elegance completely cracked. Staffers recalled how Crawford treated people based entirely on their status and power. To Johnny Carson, she was all sweetness and charm, smiling, gracious, playing the perfect movie star. But when a 20-year-old production assistant accidentally entered her dressing room with a tray of water, Crawford unleashed hell. Witnesses said she launched into a tirade so vicious that people in the hallway froze in shock. She called the young woman names, told her she was brainless and incompetent, even suggested she should find work in a brothel where incompetence might be an asset. The girl fled in tears. Crawford then demanded that she be fired immediately. Carson's producer refused, but the tension poisoned the entire taping. And what unsettled Carson the most wasn't just the cruelty, it was the performance. Crawford could flip the switch instantly, like turning a light on and off. During commercial breaks, she sat stone-faced in complete silence, cold as marble, not a hint of warmth or humanity. But the second that red light blinked on, she transformed into America's sweetheart, laughing, glowing, pretending every moment was spontaneous and delightful. Carson tried his best to connect with her during the interview, but he later told Ed McMahon, "I've interviewed corpses with more personality." That's how cold she was off camera. Years later, when Joan Crawford's daughter, Christina, published the book Mommy Dearest, exposing her alleged abuse at home, Carson wasn't surprised at all. According to his friends, he just nodded and said, "I saw who she really was in those few hours." For Johnny Carson, Joan Crawford was the perfect example of Hollywood's darkest truth. That the people, America, worshipped as icons could be ice-cold tyrants once the cameras were turned off. Number 6. Bob Hope. Bob Hope, the silver-haired king of comedy, America's favorite entertainer. For more than half a century, he was absolutely everywhere, hosting the Oscars, cracking jokes for troops overseas, shaking hands with presidents, starring in countless movies and TV specials. To the public, he was untouchable, a living legend, a national treasure who could make the entire country laugh with just a wink and a punchline. But to Johnny Carson, Bob Hope was a nightmare. Now, before we go further, let me be clear about something. Johnny Carson respected what Bob Hope represented, the history, the legacy, the decades of entertainment. But respect for someone's past doesn't mean you have to tolerate their present behavior. On camera, Hope still had that polish, that classic vaudeville timing, that endless stream of jokes that defined an entire era of American comedy. Off camera, though, Carson saw something completely different. According to Carson's longtime staff, Bob Hope was one of the very few guests who didn't wait to be invited onto The Tonight Show. He'd simply tell NBC when he wanted to appear, and that was that. It didn't matter what Carson had planned, didn't matter who else was booked, didn't matter if it disrupted the entire week's schedule. When Bob Hope wanted airtime, the network made it happen, period. And Johnny absolutely hated that. Because The Tonight Show was his kingdom, his rhythm, his rules. He'd spent years building it into the most successful talk show in television history. He earned that control. And suddenly, here was this living legend marching in like he still owned the entire stage. But the scheduling wasn't even the worst part. Hope never came to actually talk. He came to perform. Every single appearance was a scripted routine. Every line was rehearsed. Every spontaneous laugh was carefully planned in advance. Carson thrived on improvisation, on that witty, natural banter that made him America's conversational genius. That's what made The Tonight Show special. Real conversations, real moments, real laughter. But Hope? He'd sit down, completely ignore Johnny's questions, and launch straight into cue card jokes as if he were performing at a USO show. One writer who worked backstage said, "It wasn't a conversation. It was a hostage situation." Carson would just sit there smiling, nodding politely while Hope bulldozed through his pre-written material without taking a single breath. Johnny would try to engage him, ask a follow-up question, create some actual dialogue, and Hope would just barrel right past it into his next joke. It was frustrating to watch, and even more frustrating to be part of. And then came the moment that really sealed it for Carson. After one of Johnny's monologues absolutely killed, the audience was roaring with laughter. Bob Hope leaned over during the commercial break and said something shocking. "Mind if I borrow that laugh track for my special?" Johnny was speechless. Hope wasn't joking. He literally wanted to take the recorded audience laughter from The Tonight Show and use it for his own television special. That was the kind of entitlement that drove Carson absolutely insane. It showed that Hope didn't see The Tonight Show as Johnny's show. He saw it as just another platform, another place to grab material and attention for himself. The tension only grew worse as Hope got older. His eyesight started to fade. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, but he still insisted on appearing on the show over and over again. He'd read from cue cards, squinting to see the words. He'd miss his physical marks on stage. He couldn't respond naturally to anything Carson said because he literally couldn't hear him properly. It became painful to watch. And Carson, ever the professional, covered for him again and again. He'd laugh at jokes that didn't land. He'd redirect conversations that went nowhere. He'd protect Hope's image for the sake of the audience. But behind the scenes, he was furious. Not at Hope for getting old, that happens to everyone. But at Hope for refusing to admit it, for clinging to the spotlight long past the point where he could actually perform well. After one particularly painful taping where Hope ignored every question and stumbled through pre-written jokes that fell flat, Johnny turned to his crew backstage and muttered something unforgettable. "If I ever end up like that, guys, I want you to shoot me." That wasn't sarcasm. That wasn't a joke. It was heartbreak. Carson admired what Bob Hope once was. A pioneer. A comedy legend who paved the way for everyone who came after him. But he couldn't stand what Hope had become. A man so trapped in his own legacy that he forgot how to be human. Forgot how to have a real conversation. Forgot how to know when it was time to step back. What enraged Carson most wasn't the arrogance. It wasn't even the bad performances. It was the disrespect. The way Hope treated the Tonight Show staff, like they were just props in his routine. The way he ignored the flow and rhythm of the show that Johnny had carefully built. The way he assumed his name alone excused everything, the disruptions, the demands, the complete lack of consideration for anyone else. For Johnny Carson, that was unforgivable. Because his golden rule never changed, no matter who you were. Talent means nothing if you forget to treat people with respect. Bob Hope had all the talent in the world. He'd earned his place in entertainment history. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten the most important lesson. That respect isn't something you earn once and keep forever. It's something you show every single day to every single person. And so, even Bob Hope, the smiling face of American comedy for half a century, found himself quietly added to Johnny Carson's secret blacklist. Not with fanfare, not with a public statement. Just a quiet understanding among the staff that every Bob Hope appearance would be tolerated, not celebrated, endured, not enjoyed. Johnny would smile through them. Be professional. protect Hope's image for the audience who still loved him. But the moment the cameras turned off, the smile would disappear. Because Johnny Carson knew the truth that audiences never saw. Sometimes the biggest legends are the hardest to watch when they refuse to let go. Johnny Carson spent 30 years smiling alongside Hollywood's biggest names, but he also saw what the rest of America never did. Behind the gowns, the tuxedos, and the polished charm were people who could be cruel, arrogant, and sometimes downright dangerous. For Carson, it didn't matter how many Oscars you had or how many records you sold. His test was simple. How did you treat the people who couldn't give you anything in return? The makeup artists, the assistants, the camera crew, the people with no power. If you were kind to them, Johnny respected you even if you were difficult or boring as a guest. But if you showed your darkest side to those without power, you earned a permanent spot on his silent blacklist. That's why he called Jerry Lewis truly hateful. That's why he felt personally embarrassed by Mickey Rooney's behavior. That's why he was exhausted by Bette Davis's constant cruelty. That's why he was disgusted by Frank Sinatra's intimidation tactics. And that's why he was utterly chilled by Joan Crawford's icy viciousness. These weren't just difficult guests. They were the faces of Hollywood's hidden rot, and maybe that's the real lesson here. The golden age of Hollywood looked glamorous on screen. The beautiful stars, the elegant clothes, the charm and wit. But Carson's stories remind us that fame can hide just as much darkness as it reveals. The camera doesn't just add 10 pounds. It adds a layer of fiction, a mask that hides who people really are. So, the next time you see old footage of Hollywood's brightest stars, ask yourself, who were they really when the lights went off? Because if these 5 legends could hide their cruelty behind fame and charm, imagine how many others slipped through unseen. The truth is, Johnny Carson was one of the few people in Hollywood who actually cared about how stars treated regular people. And that's what made him special. That's what made him America's trusted host for 3 decades. He never forgot that the crew, the assistants, the makeup artists, they were people too. They deserved respect. And the celebrities who forgot that, they ended up on his blacklist. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.